His last words were a lie. Maybe we should have seen it coming. After all, the man was known for his lies. But when he lay there dying, I never imagined that his last words would be a lie. Growing up in a small town in the South, we didn't have much money. And my dad, well, he had dreams bigger than our budget allowed for. He wanted to go places and see things. But if you're stuck in a small town without a lot of money, your options are limited. You can only drive so far on fumes and hope. Every night before bed, Dad would tell us stories about all the places he'd been, like exotic jungles and busy cities. Sometimes these stories felt real, like they were more than just make-believe. When I was little, I used to think maybe he'd actually seen all those things. Maybe one day he'd take me along too. As I got older, though, I realized these stories were just stories.
Ow.
They were how Dad escaped from our life. One day, my brother and I found an old suitcase hidden under some floorboards in the spare room. It was filled with postcards from around the world and a few plane tickets. That's when we learned our dad wasn't just a dreamer, he was a liar. All those stories he told us, the places he claimed to have been, they weren't his. The pictures in the postcards had his face photoshopped into them. Plane tickets showed layovers in airports, not arrivals at famous landmarks. We confronted him and he didn't deny it. Instead, he told us he needed to escape from our boring town, from being a nobody. Said he was tired of living a life where everyone knew his business. I couldn't breathe, he said. So he created a new identity. And looking through the years, he lived many lives, all built on lies. As a child, I couldn't understand why someone would choose a life of lies. Now I know the truth. Sometimes people build walls of lies around themselves because the truth is too painful to admit. But no matter what excuse he gave, none of it made sense. My dad could have just been honest with us. Instead, he chose lies. We never even got mad at him. We were disappointed. Dad kept his distance after that. He didn't want to hurt us, so he moved out and got his own place. But sometimes on weekends, he'd come back home for dinner. And every time he did, he'd tell us more stories. Stories that sounded more fantastical than ever. It was as if he was trying to make up for the disappointment he'd caused us. In a way, I almost pitied him. Here he was, a grown man who could barely read or write, living a life of endless make-believe. Our dad tried to go back to school to get his GED, but he never finished. I think he felt trapped, like he couldn't do anything right. One time he came home holding a stack of papers and he looked so proud. We asked what it was, and he said he got accepted to college. I remember thinking that he must have done all those fake trips to make money for college. He finally had a chance at something real. But then a few weeks later, he came home empty-handed and defeated. He told us he couldn't keep going. Quit. He was a failure. Broke our hearts to see him like that. But instead of talking to him, telling him he could still try again next year, I remember sitting in my room drawing pictures for the first time. I drew a picture of our family and then another one of our house. I thought maybe if I drew enough of them, one of my drawings would become real, just like Dad's stories. It sounds ridiculous now, but I really believed that if I could just draw hard enough, my pictures would become true. It was the only way I knew how to cope. Over time, Dad started taking longer trips. First it was just weekends away, but soon he was gone for weeks at a time. We didn't hear from him often, and the calls we did get were always from payphones or hotels. He was always in a different place, never the same one twice. Then one day, Dad didn't come home for dinner. He didn't call either. Mom was worried, but she told us not to be. Your dad knows how to take care of himself, she said. But I knew she was lying. I could see it in her eyes. She was afraid. A few days later, 2 police officers came to our house. They were young and nice-looking. They sat us down and told us they needed to ask us some questions about Dad. Questions like, do you know where your father is? Does he have any friends in other towns? What kind of car does he drive? It was obvious that Dad was in trouble, but even then, his lies protected him. He didn't have any close friends, not that we knew of. He drove an old pickup truck that looked like it had been through the apocalypse. So the police didn't know where to start looking. Before they left, one of the officers told us we should tell them right away if we heard from Dad. Then they were gone. The questions kept us up at night. Where was Dad? Was he in trouble because of his lies? Remember hugging my mom so tight, wanting to tell her everything I thought, but I was scared. Scared of what she'd say, scared of what would happen. One morning, Mom took us to a park across town. Usually she only let us play there when she had to work late, but this time it was different. She sat on a bench and watched us while we played, and that's when she finally told us the truth. Dad had run off with a woman from work. He left behind a note saying he was sorry, but he had to follow his heart. It wasn't our fault, Mom said, but I knew it was. It was all because of Dad's lies. If he hadn't lied to us, Mom wouldn't have had to lie to us. After that day, Mom started dating one of her coworkers. He was nice, but it wasn't the same. He was always busy and Mom was working extra shifts. Soon, we hardly saw him at all. We were on our own most nights. My brother and I looked after each other. We got good grades in school and eventually went away to college. Then one day I got a phone call. It was my mom. She was crying. I could hear it in her voice. She told me she'd found Dad in a hotel room. He'd had a heart attack and died. I remember feeling angry. Angry that he'd left us behind. Angry that he'd lied to us for so long. When I arrived at the funeral home, my mom was sitting in a corner. I sat down next to her and she told me everything. Turns out Dad had been sick for a while. He'd had a heart condition all along. He knew he might die, so he ran away to find love. He was sorry for leaving us behind, Mom said, but I knew he wasn't. He had chosen that life, not ours. At the funeral, we said goodbye to Dad. I don't remember what I said, but it didn't matter. No one was listening anyway. When we got back home, we emptied out Dad's things. There were letters and photos and plane tickets. So many lies. And then we found a box filled with old cassette tapes. We didn't have a cassette player, but we found one in the attic. Then we listened. On the first tape, Dad's voice was shaky, but excited. He talked about how he met this woman, how he loved her. On the second tape, his voice was stronger, more confident. He talked about how happy he was, how he'd found the one. And on the third tape, his voice was weak, barely a whisper. He was talking about how he wasn't sure if he was going to make it, how he was sorry, and then the tape ended. There was nothing else. After we heard the tapes, we knew our dad was sorry. But his last words were a lie. He never called us to say goodbye. He never told us he loved us. He didn't even bother to say he was sorry until his last breath. Now, whenever I hear a loved one's last words were a lie, I wonder, were they hiding something from us all along? Or was it just their way of saying goodbye?